Hello, I'm Yulia Navalnaya. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. As always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Sunbathing on a Spanish beach, sipping cocktails in Italy, skiing in the Alps, all while Russia bombs Ukraine and threatens Europe. This summer, 500,000 Russians vacationed across the European Union. And now Brussels is asking a blunt question. Should Russians still get to enjoy Europe while their government effectively wages war against it? This week, the European Union has been preparing its 19th sanctions package. 19. And with each round, the question becomes harder. How do you punish Russia without punishing the wrong people? And how do you stop Moscow's agents without breaking your own rules? Without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
The EU has postponed a 19th sanctions package against Russia amid talk of tightening the noose around Moscow's oil export empire. Brussels is offering strong words of support, but given the delay, they do seem quite hollow.
We must hit Russian banks, energy companies, crypto exchanges and shadow fleet ships harder. Depriving Moscow of the funds to wage a war is an essential way to end this conflict.
Oil wasn't the only thing discussed when it came to this package, however. Some EU member states put forward the idea of a blanket ban on Russian tourists across the entire bloc. Although the entire Schengen zone has become unfriendly, to say the least, to Russian tourists, it is specific countries like Poland or the Baltic states that have cracked down on tourist visas for Russians and other reasons for entry. These are countries which were very swift to act on barring Russian citizens from crossing their borders in the wake of the Russian invasion. While a country like Estonia may have supported a blanket ban on Russian tourist entries, other countries like Italy or Spain have been notoriously against this for several reasons, usually linked to their respective economies. Although banning Russian oil imports has been a very controversial issue, one of the reasons why the latest sanctions package has been postponed is most likely linked to the issue of Russian tourists.
And now let's zone in on the explaining portion of our show. Despite the official statements coming out of Brussels, the European Union isn't as single-minded when it comes to Russian tourism as it would seem at first glance. While some countries have completely suspended tourist visas for Russians, others allow them to visit without much difficulty.
Among the countries which issue travel visas to Russians are some heavy hitters like France, Italy and Spain. Overall in 2024, EU countries issued more than 500,000 Schengen visas to Russians, a significant drop from the 4 million in 2019, yes, but also a 30% increase compared to 2023. Since the start of the Russian invasion, the visa application process for Russian citizens has become far more complex and requires much more documentation. Nonetheless, thousands of Russians can reach the countries that have suspended tourist visas for them, like the Baltic states, by simply going through Spain, for example. Russians have also been using countries like Turkey as transit hubs on their journey to the European Union. The authorities from the countries which have essentially banned direct visits from Russian tourists have condemned these loopholes, but these criticisms seem to have fallen on deaf ears, as observers warn that if a Russian tourist wants to visit a European country, they can. All they need is a little more paperwork.
And now, as always, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Over 500,000 Russians visited the European Union in 2024. That's more than the year before, a record in fact. They poured into Schengen states, particularly southern holiday destinations like Spain, Italy, Greece and France. Meanwhile, on the front line, countries bordering Russia, Poland, the Baltics, the Czech Republic and Finland have practically slammed the door shut. For them, Russian visitors aren't just a nuisance, they are a security risk. So what Brussels is now considering is a harmonized approach. Instead of individual countries setting their own rules, the bloc could agree on new restrictions together. Now, some hawkish governments want nothing less than a full ban on Russian tourists. Others, particularly those who profit from Russian spending, are rather hesitant. The split is as much about economics as it is about ethics. Now, supporters of a ban say it is obscene to allow Russians to sip wine in Tuscany while their government levels cities in Ukraine. One EU diplomat put it bluntly: we can't just accept Russians enjoying their lives while their government is killing Ukrainians and threatening our security daily. But then there is the other argument, led by Russian opposition figures themselves. Yulia Navalnaya, the widow of Alexei Navalny, has urged the European Union not to punish ordinary Russians. Her letter to Brussels makes the point. Sanctions should hit oligarchs, propagandists, and regime cronies. She argues we should not slam the door shut on ordinary citizens, especially those who may be quietly against the regime. Now, this tension between collective responsibility and targeted justice is at the heart of the debate. On one side, Europe doesn't want to be seen as xenophobic. On the other, it doesn't want its cities full of the wealthy Russian elite who, let's be honest, are often closer to Putin than to the opposition. Now, there is also a second parallel debate over diplomats. Russian embassies and consulates across Europe have long been notorious for harboring intelligence officers. The Czech Republic knows this better than anyone, as it expelled dozens of Russian agents with diplomatic cover after discovering their involvement in sabotage. Prague's idea, backed by other frontline states, is simple. Limit Russian diplomats to the country where they are accredited. If you're assigned to Berlin, you stay in Berlin. You don't use your Schengen visa to hop around Europe plotting God knows what. The logic is clear. If Russian agents are abusing Schengen privileges, then restricting their travel cuts down the room for mischief. The problem, however, is in enforcing it. Whatever decision emerges in the coming weeks, it will send a signal. Either that Europe is willing to sacrifice revenue and convenience to isolate Moscow further, or that 3 years into the war, it still isn't ready to close all the doors. And now here to shed more light on this story is Joshua Bergen, founder of the Alliance for Global Security. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Good morning. Nice to be with you today.
So tourism, it is a very nice thing to do. Sometimes it is perfectly innocent. Other times you might just be a Russian tourist traveling to Salisbury to admire the local cathedral, if you catch my drift. But do you really think that the latest concept, which the European Union seems to be going for, namely expanding all those restrictions, or even basically banning all Russian tourists from the continent, is it practicable and is it a good idea?
Well, as an execution matter, I think it's probably well within the scope of doable. Since the launch of the Ukraine war in 2021, I've encountered plenty of Russians who've said how much harder it was to get to Europe for reasons of lack of flights, for reasons of visas, etc. As a practical matter, certainly there are some that are coming towards the West for issues of conscience, freedom, etc. But embedded within these is elements of the Russian state that are engaged in intelligence collection, mayhem, gray zone activities, and so you can see where, at least from a counterintelligence perspective, from a counteroperation standpoint from Europe, pretty difficult to determine who's a tourist, who's a bad guy, who's there to do who's up to no good, and frankly, it's unfortunately a bit of guilt by association.
So it's going to be a bit of a back and forth, right, when it comes to arguments, because we have, on the other hand, arguments of countries like Poland, like the Baltic states, and they know exactly what Russians are capable of. But then on the other hand, you have the less hawkish part of the European Union, and also people who think, okay, we also need to remain open towards dissidents, like the West did during the Cold War. So now, let's take a look at the other side of the argument. There was a recent article published by the Center for European Policy Analysis, and that argued that if we do this, if we introduce a blanket ban, we will no longer have any sway over the possibility of democratic change in Russia. We will effectively be hindering it. Would you agree with this sort of argument?
Well, I think it's not unreasonable to have some concerns. I mean, even in the height of the Cold War, there was always a process by which Soviet, Russian, Warsaw Pact country individuals, they might be denied a visa per se, but could seek asylum. There was a process for seeking asylum, and I think that's a different standard than, oh, we're a tourist coming to Europe. I personally have no problem if tourism for Russians is banned around the world. The notion of banning all Russians from traveling, no ability to seek asylum, I think there should be an asylum process. We understand how beneficial that was in the past. And to your point, we can certainly understand how those further away from the border are less concerned about them. And frankly, some of these countries are looking for the money to come from those golden ones that are part of the oligarchic families or the government families that love to travel and spend their money in Europe.
No, exactly. I mean, there were even calculations provided by the Ukrainian press, which said that, okay, these governments can see that the average Russian tourist actually spends much, much more when they actually go on holiday in countries like Spain or Greece. So when these governments are aware of such statistics, they might be thinking, okay, so perhaps this gold mine is something that we might keep running for a while. But can the rest of Europe actually persuade them that this is effectively false economy to some extent?
Well, it's certainly an incentive. I mean, the degree to which mankind, governments, businesses will make exceptions when it represents large money. But at the end of the day, I mean, Russia is clearly dedicated to creating mayhem in Europe. I mean, we've seen for literally the past 2 decades, as government officials will rail against Europe, rail against the United States, and then send their kids to universities there, send them for internships, scholarships. There's a real duplicity in terms of the benefit that the elites in Russia want to receive from the Western world, and then the way they're using the apparatus of the state to actually harm the very places that they themselves are spending time. I'm still quite at if we look back in time, Mr. Ronald Reagan came to the Brandenburg Gate and gave a speech for which his colleagues basically told him, "Don't say this." And he said openly to Mr. Gorbachev, "If you seek peace, if you seek prosperity, come to the gate, open the gate, tear down the wall." Peace prevailed. Prosperity was a hallmark of the 90s, again, past the initial early stages of the 90s, in the 2000s, even now. And frankly, I don't understand why the Russians themselves are pursuing such a policy of violence, mayhem, because it's only basically returned to the difficult past. A lack of peace, lack of prosperity, no hope for Russians. I mean, Ukraine is facing a real, it's taking the brunt of this. But if you're a Russian citizen and you have hopes for yourselves in the world, your future is looking pretty bleak because of the actions of your government. And it's really unfortunate. And to that, and the spillover effects on things like tourism, the spillover effects on things like trust for Russians traveling abroad. Unfortunately, like I said earlier, guilt by association.
So could it be that we're looking at a very different society today than we actually had during the Cold War? Because the argument that was given concerning our ability to use our soft power during that period, well, that was a compelling argument. However, isn't this the case that back then most ordinary Russians were longing to get in touch with the West? They wanted to travel the world. They wanted to learn more. They wanted to escape the oppressive system. But now the propaganda seems to have implanted in them the idea that the West is basically, it's decadent. It is evil itself. Could it be that the propaganda was so efficient, so effective, that right now the Russians are not susceptible to our soft power, and they might travel to Europe, just because, these are trendy, attractive holiday destinations, but they will not learn anything. They will not bring back any sort of Western ideas back to Russia, because they have already been so heavily indoctrinated that this doesn't work anymore. What do you think?
Well, certainly the Russian state, the Kremlin, is controlling all media. I mean, this was at the point that Putin took power. The Kremlin began wrestling back private sector media, wrestling back control of the entire apparatus of narrative. And so you're not wrong. You're absolutely correct. Propaganda is alive and well and happening within the borders of Russia and being pushed out to influence diaspora abroad, etc. I'm not sure that we can entirely compare the past to current situation. Yes, I want to say that there was a city on the hill-like quality for the Western world. Russians were in pretty desperate and dire living conditions throughout the Soviet period. But that's radically changed. Their quality of life improved dramatically. Many of them have traveled in recent years. To that end, it's never going to be a mass percentage of the population that wishes to uproot their lives and move. This is always a vanishing small 1%, 3% maximum. I don't know that it quite relates to people being willing to uproot themselves and leave, but I do think that you do make at least some valid point that there's a little less of a vacuum in quality of life or the incentives. The war is diminishing Russian quality of life, but they've enjoyed a quality of life that is coming online or getting much, much closer to the standards of Europe over the past, say, 20 to 30 years, especially in the big cities.
So perhaps the European Union should heed the arguments advanced by the Ukrainian side. After all, the Ukrainians are saying simply, why should Russians be enjoying the ability to travel all across the European Union when Ukrainians, not only they cannot do that for many, because of the intensity of war, because of the fact that, once again, their quality of life has been diminished by Russian aggression. But also because effectively the entire country is being attacked by Russia on a daily basis. So do you think this element of injustice should be the decisive factor here? That, our policy should be shaped not only by economic considerations, not only by questions of expediency, but ultimately also ethics. And, allowing Russians to travel freely across Europe, that doesn't sit well with our concept of ethics.
Well, I don't know if I'd use this as a blanket strategy. If their effort is to persuade, if the goal is to persuade European political figures, that argument might work with some. I think there's a broader security question that comes into play, and that is, can you determine of these that would apply for visas from Russia to the European Union, can you identify who is simply a tourist, who is benign, versus who represents a form of malignancy, somebody who could indeed be engaged in sabotage, intelligence collection, etc. And the inability to reliably determine between the two, and the very real notion today that those traveling out of Russia are coming exclusively out of the elite side, the government sort of blessed side, I think it would give pause. Is that question of justice, fairness, a viable argument for some? Perhaps. It's not necessarily the one that I would advance.
So now there was a counter-argument given that with respect to all those Russian tourists, but also with respect to Russian diplomats, because this is another aspect of the discussion, whether we should actually restrict Schengen visa for Russian diplomats already present here, because some of them might actually be engaged in espionage. The counter-argument was that Russians tend to outsource these operations, these malign activities, to people who are of different ethnicities and nationalities. They're not Russians. They sometimes are, Belarusians, Bulgarians, Romanians. Ultimately, they tend to exploit people who are vulnerable to certain types of propaganda, but also who can be persuaded to do questionable things for money. And this tactic will not be in any way constrained by the inability of Russians to travel if the money will still be, making its way towards people who are willing to engage in some sort of questionable activities. And it's not going to help. Do you think that this argument holds water, though?
Well, that would assume that the Russians have effectively stopped using their own operatives to do anything in the gray zone and only hire contractors. And this just doesn't hold water. Yes, it's a tactic. Yes, it's a percentage of their activities are through contractors or cutouts, but that's by no means the whole. And so you sort of spoke to diplomatic community. I mean, frankly speaking, the notion that we haven't seen more of the Russian diplomatic corps across Europe PNG'd or returned to their country, that we haven't seen more sort of public acknowledgement of credentials being presented by the part of the Russians for new diplomats and them being denied. This is a usual sort of tit for tat, and frankly, I'm kind of surprised we haven't seen more of that in the media.
Joshua Bergen was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight. And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. The United States and Ukraine have agreed to earmark $150 million for the so-called minerals deal. The money is meant to kickstart the Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund.
The fund is a project that gives the United States special access to mineral sites in Ukraine. The earmarked sum will be split evenly between Kiev and Washington, so $75 million per party, with Ukraine splitting its share of the money between the 2025 and 2026 budgets. Although the money has been formally committed, interested companies can't begin submitting their projects for financing until at least late November. This is because the fund's board still needs to hire an administrator, open necessary bank accounts, and approve various investment guidelines. The US has been interested in Ukraine's critical raw materials such as lithium and gas since the Trump administration came into power earlier this year. The new deal gives Washington favorable access to investment projects in Ukraine, which relate to natural resources and even defense ventures.
Yulia Navalnaya, Alexei Navalny's widow, says that two separate medical lab reports show that her husband was poisoned prior to his death. Navalny was serving time in a Russian Arctic penal colony at the time of his demise.
Navalnaya is continuing her late husband's work to oppose the Kremlin and bring to light the circumstances surrounding Navalny's mysterious death while in prison. Russian authorities have refused to investigate these circumstances despite Navalny having been a very high-profile opposition figure. Now, his widow says that his biological samples were in fact obtained last February and secretly smuggled abroad. Navalnaya has hinted that the lab tests may have been conducted in either Europe or North America, as she had accused Western countries of also refusing to investigate her husband's death. The laboratories which allegedly conducted the analyses have so far supposedly refused to officially publish their results.
Russia's Gazprom has announced a 10-day halt in gas supplies to Armenia over an alleged need to repair infrastructure. This is the third time in 3 months that the Russian gas giant has made such a decision.
Gazprom has historically been one of Russia's most important tools when it comes to exerting political pressure on countries that it supplies energy to. Some observers believe that the Kremlin has been behind the repeated halts in gas deliveries to Armenia to pressure the country to turning down its recent geopolitical turn towards the West. The latest suspension of gas deliveries was announced by Gazprom Armenia with only a 24-hour notice, despite the alleged repairs having supposedly been planned far in advance. According to Gazprom's statement, Armenian customers should not experience any interruptions due to internal reserves and further gas supplies from Iran. This is not the first time this year that the Russian company has suspended the flow of gas to Armenia, as both in July and August a similar situation took place, although both of those suspensions lasted only a couple of days.
End of the line for this episode of Eastern Express, but please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news, updates and commentary. I'm Jonasz Rewinski. Bye for now.